Here we go. Welcome everyone. My name is Sean Thibodeau. I'm the coordinator of community planning at the Pollard Memorial Library. Welcome to our virtual talk this evening featuring distinguished Professor Robert Forrant of UMass Lowell, who will be talking a lecture entitled Civil Rights History 1950 to 1975, and that's American Civil Rights History. And Robert's done just a lot of things in the Lowell area, very interested in the history of Lawrence and Lowell and the workers and social justice movements. And he's a great talker, and I'm just gonna actually just turn it over to him because I really want to hear what he has to say. So please welcome Robert.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks, Pollard Library. Good evening, everybody. I am going to talk for approximately 35 minutes. So we have time, 25 minutes or longer. I'm happy to stay past 8 o'clock if people want to discuss more, talk more about the history. And so I should say at the outset, there's not a way in that amount of time to do deep justice to, obviously, civil rights history from the 1940s, 1950s to the present. So this is really pretty much an overview, highlights, and partly a way that when I'm teaching this at the university, that I think about how to introduce my students to a history that seemingly they should know something about, but in general know very little, because for whatever reason there ends up never being enough time to get to things that are controversial. Although I don't understand why civil rights history should be controversial, but in this day and age, it certainly is. This photo is a bit out of the time frame that we're talking about, but it gives you, when you look at this, a real sense of where the country was at. So we're now, if we think of the Civil War as ending in 1865, there's Reconstruction, there are all these efforts to try to deal with the legacies of the enslavement of millions of people. And here we are in the 1920s in the nation's capital with this incredible scene of a Ku Klux Klan march down Pennsylvania Avenue, full regalia, marching K at the front. And I find this just an extraordinary image. And it's not that far back in historical time for me, when I think about time periods and slices of time that I teach. 1926 is not all that long ago that this would be a scene one could have seen in the nation's capital. The other thing that you notice when you really look carefully at this photograph is there are hundreds and thousands of people all along the parade route watching the parade. You can see spectators all the way along the way when you look at the photograph. This is a photo that my students are really surprised when they see. And so really, when we think about this period from the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction, to World War II, not a lot has changed in the American South. Slavery is obviously not legal. There's constitutional amendment. But in terms of voting rights, economic rights, property rights, rights to sit on juries, all sorts of things that most of us would take for granted. None of those things were happening if you were African American in the South. And so now I want to talk more, sort of try to put this together for all of you. As the Second World War is winding down, an attempt is going to be made through Congress to try to figure out how to take care of American veterans coming back from the Second World War, how to figure out how to make a smooth transition from the battlefield back to civilian life, and as well, how to make certain that the economy, which has gone through the Great Depression just a decade before, doesn't slump back into some sort of an economic collapse as people come back from the war, as war production slows down. People are uncertain as to what's going to happen. And so the GI Bill gets passed. And amongst the things the GI Bill is intended to do is provide ways for veterans, people like my dad, who fought in the Second World War, when they came back, to be able to secure a low-cost mortgage, a low-cost loan from a bank to be able to purchase a home, single-family home. And as well, if so inclined, a person could take the benefits from the GI Bill and attend a college or a job training facility. And so what's this got to do with civil rights and civil rights history? The problem is that because of the segregated nature of America at the end of the Second World War, and the resistance, even in the North, to banks lending money to African Americans, the GI Bill, in terms of being able to purchase a home, does not impact in a positive way significant numbers of African American veterans coming back from the war, nor does the ability to go to college, because particularly in the South, where still the largest numbers of Black people live, colleges and universities are deeply, deeply, highly segregated. And so it means even if somebody, if a Black veteran coming back from the war wanted to go to college or a job training facility, they couldn't get that training. And so the importance of this is that as we think about the time period moving forward from 1945 all the way up through to where we really are today, the economic boost that the GI Bill could perhaps have given to help break down barriers in terms of economic prosperity, livelihood, opportunity for higher education and such, the GI Bill doesn't do what it might have done to begin to create a more open, less segregated society and give more people more social and economic opportunity. And this is going to come to bear as we go forward with the story. The first real attempt in the 1950s to deal with this question of segregation is largely one that's aimed at the schools. And the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, combined several lawsuits that have been working their way through the courts, and they roll them all up into one Supreme Court case, which we know of as Brown versus the Board of Education. And the Supreme Court does a really important bit of work in this particular instance by basically outlawing segregation in public schools solely on the basis of race, and saying that it denies minority groups equal educational opportunity. The problem with the bill moving forward from 1954 is with the court ruling, excuse me, is that the court ruling never really comes up with a way to, okay, so now what do we do? What's the redress? And so basically the language in the court case talks about due deliberate speed, and just somewhat vague language about what should happen. And while the important point is made, schools largely are going to stay segregated, as we'll see. At the same time as this is taking place, Rosa Parks and a number of other people have been involved in a whole series of organizing meetings and conversations for quite a bit of time to think about other ways to push civil rights. And one of the other, along with schools, one of the other deeply segregated structures in the South is the transportation system. And so over time, a number of people begin to refuse to move on public conveyances, either buses or trains. In 1898, there's a Supreme Court case which essentially says separate but equal in public transportation is okay. Separate but equal doesn't make any sense. If it's separate, it's not equal. I think we all would agree to that, but the language is the language. And so Parks and other people start refusing to move on the bus. Rosa Parks becomes perhaps the most famous of the set of people that ultimately get arrested for trying to desegregate public transportation. But she's not, and this is an important point, the only person, and it's equally important that it's known that this comes out of a whole bunch of organizing that's going on. The way usually Rosa Parks is taught in the schools is that this was very spontaneous. She left work and she was tired, and the bus driver told her to move, and she was just exasperated and tired and refused to move. No, that's not true. She could have been exasperated and tired. That part of it could have been true, but it was not a spontaneous or random act that she was engaged in. This was part of a much more broad-based, much larger movement. Again, to challenge, as we saw before, schools, segregated schools, and as well segregated public transportation. And so the Montgomery bus boycott begins, and it lasts for over a year. This is at the point where Martin Luther King becomes a much more prominent figure in the civil rights movement. He becomes very much involved in the Montgomery bus boycott. With the Supreme Court cases in the schools, attempts are going to be made around the South to integrate public schools. This is a quite famous photograph some of you may have seen before. The young woman in the front with the glasses on is Elizabeth Eckford. She's trying to get to school on the first day of school in 1957 at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And she's met by this crowd of mostly adults, some younger people, but in this shot, mostly all adults, screaming at her all sorts of horrible things, trying to prevent her from being able to get into the school. President Dwight Eisenhower, eventually, after seeing all of this play out on the news at night, actually sends the 101st Airborne to Arkansas to pave the way so 9 African-American students can get to go to school. The woman's photograph circled there comes to play in the next slide. And the woman that I had circled in the previous slide, here, right there in the very center of the screen, her name is Hazel Maisry. She's infamous in the photograph, which goes out all over the world. She and Elizabeth Eckford actually meet 40 years after the fact at a big event held in Little Rock, Arkansas, on the 40th anniversary of the efforts to integrate the school. And out of that meeting and their conversations comes this really terrific book that has a sort of a conversation back and forth about what they were thinking at the time, what their lives have been like subsequently. And so if you're interested, this is a really terrific read. And since this is a library talk, I will mention a lot of books on the way through here. The mayor of Little Rock decides that the way to deal with school integration is to close the schools. And so what happens in Little Rock, what happens in a number of school districts in Virginia and in South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, 1957, 1958, is entire school systems get shut down. I found this photo the other day when I was thinking about, how to frame everything for this evening, and it is an interesting photo that, since we're in the era of Zoom, this is a young Black woman sitting, you can see, with a notebook and a pencil or a pen there in her hand, getting her school lessons on TV. And essentially what happened is, if you were white and you had money, your parents would send you to a private school, so you didn't miss school for a year. If you were white and working class, you also suffered and were not able to go to school either, because your parents didn't have the money to pay to send you to a private school. But this was largely, obviously, targeted at African-American students to attempt to keep the schools from being integrated. And so again, this lasts for over a year. Rather than integrate the schools, simply close them. In 1959, 1960, students begin to organize. Out of the student organizations come SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and one of the things that they engage in, college and university students engage in, is sitting in at lunch counters. Most department stores during this period of time, well up into the 80s, lots of department stores in and around Lowell as well, for those of you that grew up around here, would have had a lunch counter. You could go and you could be in a Woolworths or a Grant's or a 5 and 10, whatever they were called at the time. You could buy fish, you could buy parakeets, you could buy sewing stuff you needed, yarn, household goods, whatever, but you could also get a grilled cheese. And my favorite thing with my grandma every Saturday was to go in Beverly, where I grew up, to Woolworths downtown in Beverly and get a grilled cheese sandwich and a tomato soup. And I thought I was living large. And as a kid, I was not aware that elsewhere in the country at such lunch counters, scenes like this image played out, where people tried to say, look, you let us into the store to shop, we can spend our money in the store, but you won't serve us at the lunch counter. We want equal access to the lunch counter. We want to be able to get a cup of coffee, breakfast, a grilled cheese sandwich like Bob could, or whatever. And so the violence that's perpetrated against people is really quite stunning, as this photograph shows. And these lunch counter sit-ins spread across the United States in 1960, 1961. The African-American woman that you can see who's had some food dumped on her head there, you can see it in her hair, Ann Moody wrote this autobiography, Coming of Age in Mississippi, which again, if you're interested, I've used this I've had my students read this quite a number of times, and they're always pretty stricken and struck by her life and her experiences that she delineates in this book. So it's well worth the read. There's always a Lowell connection. In 1961, the other thing that students did, as well as other civil rights groups and organizations, organized something called the Freedom Rides, which was also an attempt to integrate public transportation. And in America in the 1960s, if you were in Boston and you went to South Station and you were going to get on a train and you're going to take the train to Florida, between Boston and Virginia on that train, the train cars would be integrated. The train stations, wherever you went, would be integrated. But once you got to this sort of imaginary line where now you were entering the South, everything was supposed to be segregated. And if you were on a bus, African-American patrons of a Greyhound bus would have to sit in the back of the bus. And the same way on a train, there would be segregated train waiting rooms, bathrooms, and all the rest. And so people decided, the same as with schools and with lunch counters, to challenge this system of segregation. And so the Freedom Rides were born. The violence perpetrated against Freedom Riders was really quite stunning. The image here that's on the cover of this really well done book on the Freedom Rides shows a bus that was fully occupied, a caravan of Ku Klux Klan members and supporters sort of blockaded the bus, pushed it to the side of the road, and then before the people in the bus could get out, they lit the bus on fire with people inside. People were able to get out. Nobody died in the bus fire, but as people clambered out of the bus, smoke in their lungs, hardly being able to see from the smoke, they were beaten pretty nearly to death. Nobody died, but people were badly beaten up, and the police basically stood on the sidelines and watched. And then rather than arrest the perpetrators of the violence, they arrested people like Ellen Ziskind, who's shown here, who grew up in Lowell, went to college in New York City before her senior year of college, went on the Freedom Ride and ended up being arrested. This is her mugshot. She went on to become a psychologist with a thriving practice in Newton, Massachusetts. A few years ago, I had the chance to talk to her when I was doing stuff at the university on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act. This is an incredible photo. And again, the violence is being done to her and other people on the buses. They're the ones that end up getting arrested. Now, what's interesting is you might think with all of this protest, well, I don't know what you would think, but the Gallup poll, which was a famous polling operation done back when I was younger, probably for a lot of us, we're well aware of Gallup and Gallup polls on all sorts of things. They basically polled people in the country about what they thought about these incidents, about the lunch counter sit-ins, about the Freedom Rides. And it's interesting to see that almost 60% of the people basically said they thought it hurt. And I'm struck by this in Black Lives Matter and how a lot of people, well, Black Lives, you've gone too far, right? And so this becomes this interesting question of well then, which again, I talk about with my students, well then what else do you do? What's the alternative to doing something that creates this agenda in a public way and forces people to confront these issues that we've been talking about? This is pretty striking. 4 or 5 years from the school desegregation cases, lunch counter sit-ins, freedom rides, and public opinion not swayed yet. Colleges and universities are now going to be challenged as well. This is probably one of the most famous cases, James Meredith. In the photograph here, a military veteran comes back, wants to go to law school, University of Mississippi. The governor doesn't want the school, University of Mississippi integrated. The governor is a guy by the name of Ross Barnett. When Meredith enters the campus, Ross Barnett withdraws the state police, which would have nominally been there to protect Meredith. A mob of people thinking Meredith's in a particular building invade the building, rush the building. Fortunately for Meredith, he's not inside. But in the melee that follows, as people ransack the building looking for James Meredith, 2 people lose their lives and 50 federal marshals are injured, 28 by gunfire. So think about that. 50 federal marshals are injured, 28 by gunfire. President Kennedy, who's been reluctant to use the federal government to interfere, now realizes he needs to do something, and he orders federal troops to the campus. This photograph is quite striking. The military rolling into the University of Mississippi, and 23,000 federal troops stay on the campus for a year so that Meredith can attend the University of Mississippi Law School. Things are now going to escalate even more quickly. On April 12th of 1963, there are a number of demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King is arrested. He writes probably one of the most famous civil rights documents of all. He writes something called the Letter from a Birmingham Jail, where he articulates sort of what he's feeling at this particular juncture in time. Think of the Gallup poll that I showed earlier. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. Along with Martin Luther King in jail on the Saturday of the Easter Sunday of that Easter weekend, hundreds of Birmingham young people, middle school, high school students, march and protest, and they're met with fire hoses and dogs, and hundreds of them are thrown in jail as well. This becomes a fairly common scene across the South. And this becomes more and more a scene on the nightly news. We're in a period of time in America where there's just 3 TV stations. My students find this hard to believe. You actually had to get up from your seat and change the channel physically. And the nightly news is on for an hour from 6 to 7. And the 2 big stories as the 60s progress are the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, and the growing protest movement against the Vietnam War. And so the nightly news increasingly brings the civil rights struggle out of what's largely the South at this point into living rooms across the country. Kennedy now, after Birmingham, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, his attorney general, his brother, they're really worried that in the Birmingham jail, they're fearful that Martin Luther King will actually be murdered in the jail. Obviously, he's not. But Kennedy now is moving in the direction of realizing the federal government needs to do something. Again, he's been reluctant. He's not been a really strong advocate for civil rights. Nor has his brother been. But as the violence grows, as the protest movements grow, he ultimately comes to the conclusion, really just months before he's going to be assassinated, that the country needs a federal civil rights law. And he speaks to the nation on June 11th, 1963, talking about how people, young Black kids need equal educational opportunity. We have to afford all Americans equal rights and equal opportunity. And he calls for Congress to pass a civil rights bill. In the early hours of June 12th, virtually in answer to Kennedy's speech, Medgar Evers, who's the leader, field officer for the Mississippi NAACP, is murdered, shot in the back in his driveway as he returns from being in Jackson, Mississippi with other members of the NAACP watching Kennedy's speech. And his death actually galvanizes even more support for a civil rights bill in 1964. There's a photograph of Evers' widow and young son at the funeral. Person responsible for shooting down Evers in his driveway is Byron D. LeBeckwith, photographed here. He is put on trial. People think right away he's the one that did it. He's put on trial twice in 1964, both times found not guilty by all white, all male juries, refusal to convict. It takes until 1994. In 1989, more evidence comes to light because Medgar Evers' widow, Myrlie Evers, keeps pushing the case. Ultimately, the federal government takes up the case again, and he's found guilty on February 5th, 1994. So from 64 to 94, before he's found guilty. And it's well known across Mississippi that he had done the deed. And again, momentum, more momentum, things are building. March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. This is a massive march. Some of you on this listening now might have even been there at the time. I was not. I was probably too young for my parents to let me go, and too young to know I could sneak. And so I was not there, but I did. I remember watching it on television. Again, shortly after that speech in '63, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Lyndon Johnson, now vice president, elevated to president, a son of the South, Southern Democrat, essentially now, and maybe some historians think might have been the only person that could have pushed something through. He decides he's going to push hard and get a civil rights bill passed. He goes to Richard Russell, another Southern senator, deeply segregationist, completely opposed to civil rights bill, anything to do with voting rights. Johnson says essentially to Russell, I'm doing this whether you want me to or not. Get out of the way, I'm going to run you over. Russell responds, you may get it passed, but if you do, you're going to not only lose the election, which obviously he does not, he wins the presidency in '64, but you will lose the South forever. This is really a historic moment where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party begin to switch places, where largely in the South, the political party of strength and prominence throughout the South is the Democratic Party. Through the 1960s, the Republican Party is viewed as the party of Lincoln, the party of the Civil War, the party of Reconstruction. But now the roles are going to switch, and slowly the wheels are going to turn to the point where we have sort of the flip-flop that we think of today. It's hard when I talk to my students about how the Democratic Party was the strong political party in the South. Again, it's sort of without the historical background, it's difficult sometimes for them to realize. But this becomes an important moment with a civil rights bill being passed, and then in '65, a voting rights bill being passed. Sort of again, what pushes and the drama in all of this, the movement itself is not letting up, taking their foot off the gas, even though Johnson has now come out for some sort of a civil rights bill. And Freedom Summer in 1964, large numbers of college students in the North go and work with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and their focus is Mississippi and getting people registered to vote in Mississippi. There's an awful lot of violence against this organizing campaign, particularly targeting Northern college students, but as well Black Mississippians who are trying to register people to vote. And one of the more famous sort of moments within all of this history, something that a lot of us would definitely remember, is the disappearance of James Chaney, Michael Schwimmer, and Andrew Goodman, who are trying to register people to vote in Mississippi. They disappear on June 21. They're arrested. They're held in jail. The police release them into the hands of the Ku Klux Klan after dark, and they're disappeared. Their friends and other people in the movement are calling for an investigation. Where are they? What happened to them? The governor of Mississippi basically calls this fake news, and says they're actually all up north. They're fine. They're just doing this as a publicity stunt to gain more support for the movement. Their bodies are discovered 2 months later. Edgar Ray Killen is responsible for the murder of all three of them, the same way as in the earlier case. Takes a long time before he's actually convicted of manslaughter. The painting here is a Norman Rockwell, one of his more famous, I think, paintings, titled Southern Justice, Murder in Mississippi, where he's depicting, if you will, the final minutes of the three young men's lives. Very powerful image. Civil Rights Bill gets signed in the summer of 1964 while all this is going on, while they're still looking for the three. LBJ signs the Civil Rights Bill. 1 year later, he signs the Voting Rights Act. We have these two pieces of historic landmark civil rights legislation, a major sort of sea change, if you will, from 1950 to 1965, about 15 years of really concerted political pressure, social movement pressure. This doesn't come without a cost. In the year that the Voting Rights Act is passed, 1965, importantly, this is, we all are aware of and know of the passing of John Lewis just a little while ago. March of 1965, March 7, is the march, Civil Rights March over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, when John Lewis has his skull fractured and nearly dies. After the violence on the bridge, there's a call for ministers to go south to support the continued march, and James Reeb, who is a Unitarian minister in Boston, heeds the call, goes down to Alabama. He and two other ministers are out to dinner. They leave the restaurant or walking back to their hotel. They're set upon by a gang of white men. They're all beaten pretty badly. Reeb gets the worst of it, has a serious head trauma, and loses his life 2 days later. And this becomes a big deal in Boston. I'm a freshman in college this year in Boston and went to all sorts of commemorative marches and things after this. In the same time period, in the same time frame, Jonathan Daniels, who's a seminarian, Episcopal, born in Keene, New Hampshire, a military veteran, graduate of the Virginia Military Virginia Military Institute, also goes south as well in the spring summer of 65, and he meets a death similar to Reeb's. He's not beaten, he's shot with a shotgun. Broad daylight, everybody knows Tom Coleman did it. Nothing happens to Coleman. And again, so when you think of today and we think of sort of what's happened with Breonna Taylor or, James Floyd or anybody, all sort of stuff that's happened, right, in the last two and a half, 3 years, Trayvon Martin, it's not an accident that lots of people don't believe the justice system is going to work. Within the African-American community, people know these stories. They understand these stories more actually than the larger white society, I think, does. And so it's no accident that people would be suspicious of the justice system. Have 2 or 3 more slides and then I will be finished with what I'm doing. So with this passage of the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act, Martin Luther King and others in the movement begin to turn their attention more to the economy and to saying, well, it's great that we have civil rights and voting rights, but if we don't have equal access to job opportunities, if we don't have, if there's not job creation in urban America where the majority of African Americans, particularly in the North, live, we're going to end up with 2 societies. And so this becomes another one of these moments for King where he makes this address in March mid-March of 1968, just a few weeks before he's going to lose his life um, in Memphis, Tennessee. And he articulates this and essentially says there are really now two Americas. And he sort of lays this out. I'm not going to read all of this, but he's essentially talking about how there's not equal economic opportunity for large numbers of people in the country, and that the next battle, as far as he's concerned, is to deal with this economic inequality, which is what he's doing when he loses his life on April 4th in Memphis, Tennessee. He's there supporting the striking sanitation workers. And so he's articulating this vision, but he's also there backing it up. And so really, I'm going to sort of jump really quick to try to tie this up in a bow and then have enough time to talk. The period from, I would say, from 1970, 25 or 30 years, 1970 to approximately 2000, the country goes through this this really profound deindustrialization. And the impact of this is felt across the working class, but it's felt deeply in the Black working class, because it's only in the 1960s and 1970s that lots of industrial jobs are really opening up to Black workers, precisely at the moment when those jobs are beginning to disappear. And why does that matter? Those jobs carried with them good wages and, importantly, benefits like medical insurance, dental insurance, all sorts of other things. They carried with them pensions, retirement programs, the stuff of things like my dad, who was a union meat cutter, could depend upon and count on as he got older and retired from work. There would be a pension, there would be health insurance continued by his union, there would be all of these things which African-American community was largely shut out from, and was only beginning to get their toe wet in gaining access to some of these things at the precise point when all of these jobs are beginning to disappear, and when we're getting this really profound social dislocation in urban America. We're also, at the same time, we're sort of in this moment, this kind of historic moment where Barack Obama is elected to the presidency, but it's at the precise moment as well that Donald Trump begins to appear. And we forget this sometimes in terms of the history, and we think that Trump only arrived on the scene when he came down the escalator to announce that he was running for president. But he had been laying out the breadcrumbs and the argument and the trail in the entirety of the time that Barack Obama was in office. Because from the point where Obama ran for the presidency, got the nomination, and was running against John McCain, Donald Trump and others took up this charge that of birtherism against Barack Obama, and this really burned deeply inside the more conservative wing of the Republican Party. It sort of gave license to a lot of these talk radio folks whose names are on the slide, and it really begins to create this really highly volatile conversation about race in America. And so I'm going to sort of close this with two more slides. Again, go back to where I started with the GI Bill, with the possibility that it held out had it been equally implemented amongst Black veterans and white veterans. The fact that it wasn't has a lot to do, I think, with what the Pew Research Center found in the early 2000s as it studied income inequality in America, and found these really staggering statistics in terms of the differences in Black wealth and white wealth. And again, wealth, for me at least, in my family, my dad could buy a house with the GI Bill. That becomes part of a legacy, that becomes part of building wealth, that becomes part of generational upward economic mobility. If people are closed out of that possibility, we get this sort of imagery here. And this is quite stunning when you look at it. Life expectancy is sharply different between African Americans and whites. We see this particularly now with the pandemic, where the communities that's hitting hard, not just African American communities, but now Latino communities, Asian American communities, lots of communities are really hit much harder, African American communities particularly. But you can see the staggering difference in terms of family wealth by race and ethnicity over the period, basically the period of time that I'm talking about this evening. And absent a way to try to figure out how we overcome some of that, again, it's obviously it's important that there be civil rights and that there be voting rights, but the structural inequality is so deep and so profound that it really becomes this incredibly important question, and it becomes it's like a lightning rod, difficult question for people to talk about, right? And so usually this comes up when people will talk about reparations, right? It's sort of like, okay, what's the legacy of segregation, of slavery? How's that impact today? And generally, white society at large will usually say, well, I didn't do it, so why do I have to pay for it? And we get stuck right there. And so this is a conversation we've never fully had, but this is pretty stark when you look at it. And it really is a challenge for Joe Biden, for anybody that comes after him. Massachusetts, if you did this for Massachusetts, it would be just as stark. If you did African American household incomes in Massachusetts compared to white household incomes, the gap would be just as sharp. And so this really does become a significant challenge as we go forward. And I will stop right there. I will stop screen sharing. I think I will stop.
You can leave it up.
Okay, I'll leave it there then.
Why not? So if folks have questions, you can put them in the chat. I have a couple. I mean, that was a great presentation, Robert. And
if there's not a lot of people, maybe we can hear them too.
Yeah, maybe come off mute. I wonder about, a couple of things went through my head when especially this last graphic too. Talk about wage disparities in America today, and how it's worse than it's been since like the Gilded Age. The wealth disparities across everyone, and I wonder if the fact that like the 1% is 100% white skews that number way up, because I think, and this is no scientific, and maybe just some things that I've read or taken in recently, but it's the politics of resentment and like the wedge issue of like this scapegoating of affirmative action or others, like a lot of white people that are on the lower economic end feel anger and resentment towards anyone that's not like them, and I wonder if that drives some of the current situation that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think just go back to the slide of the schools being closed. Working class white kids don't get school either. But the argument that the governors in Alabama and Mississippi and whatnot will make, well, at least you're not black.
Right.
And people fall for it. And so it's the same way immigrants and refugees get attacked. It's an easy argument to make to keep people divided, and sadly, oftentimes people fall for it.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I think there's great wage disparity all the way along, right? If you just lump everybody together and do percentiles of income inequality, income growth over the years, certainly the high end is where all the growth has been, and everybody else, white or black, is flatlined pretty much, right? So yeah, but we don't do these conversations well, and we are now in this dilemma where, at least for me, a dilemma where if you talk about these issues, then you're quickly attacked as being a socialist or a communist.
Right.
Sort of that terminology has resurrected itself. And it's funny, I think, like people calling Joe Biden a socialist is like, I mean, it's it's laughable and it's not, but it just shows how little we're able to have these sorts of conversations.
I was going to comment, when Joe Biden's asked about racial inequalities, he often will bring up wealth, like in the African American community, that, that's the thing, that's the driver, and I was thinking about, Martin Luther King's, it wasn't just, civil rights. It was, he had a big poor people's campaign, a big like jobs campaign. There's, people need a purpose. People need living wages. And you touched on that a little bit, and, it's interesting that if you broaden the net, then hopefully the rising tide will lift all boats, but people have to be willing to share. And I think just playing on people's, anger at the system, without addressing some of like the principal causes, being like the erosion of the middle class, over the 20th century, kind of like, just, I don't know, the target is misaligned for the thing that's really maligning what's going on. And then also, I feel like you talked a lot, and I'm talking a lot too. And if people want to come off mute or send questions in, that's great. But I also was thinking about, you said that Trump, appeared during the Obama, but I recently watched a documentary called Hamlin and Breslin, Deadline Artists, about the New York columnists, Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill, and talking about Bernie Goetz and the Central Park Five in the 80s.
Yep.
And I was too young to really know about that. But like as a continuation of, racist legacy in America passed through the 70s, the reaction that New York had to that, and in specific, Donald Trump, who took out a full page ad when the Central Park Five, which is five black kids, were arrested for, and they weren't even charged yet, but they had been arrested in suspecting of raping and killing a jogger in Central Park. And Donald Trump took out a full page ad calling for New York to reinstitute the death penalty for these thugs. And, it's just like that kind of hatred goes back. And of course, they were convicted and they served, 25 years. And then it come to find out someone else confessed to it after that time had been served. And they, DNA evidence proved that other person did it. So they went to jail needlessly. So it's just, I don't know, connecting.
Yeah, and when Trump was asked about that, like, did he regret anything about taking out that newspaper ad? He said, well, they were guilty of something.
Yeah, right. Being black, right?
That was his answer. Well, they definitely did something. So whatever. Yeah, I get. It's really, yeah. I mean, it's where we still are. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really sad. I wonder, it's like your dad punishes you, and it's like, well, you must have had done something. I don't know. I wonder if his dad used to do that to him and turns it around. I don't know. I hope we're entering a period of healing though in this country. I really do.
Yeah, I'm not that optimistic.
Well, can you talk maybe a little bit about your observations on the Black Lives Matter movement and how, I have a pet opinion, and maybe you think I'm way off base, but I think the lockdowns have made people a little bit crazy, but maybe a little bit more contemplative and a little bit more ready to understand that we all suffer similarly, and maybe even a bit more empathetic. I think, casting political rhetoric aside about like some of the talks about what the protests actually are, I do think that the fact that they exist is a hope for the future. And I don't know if you share that, but I'd like to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that was in the summer, everybody being, as many people being engaged and involved, particularly after just sort of being eyewitness to murder, if you will, with George Floyd. that it became, you know, one of these sort of litmus tests in a way for the country, you know, sort of like Medgar Evers or Martin Luther King in the 60s. And it challenged people. But it also, I think, so if you look at all of that in the summer and all of that activity, but then you look at sort of where the current election season ended up, we're still deeply divided, right? I mean, we're still in this sort of moment where, again, thinking of the current president as well, with sort of what happened, you know, in Virginia, Charlottesville, you know, good people on both sides. So we're still there, right? Where you have about 78 million voters voting one way and 71 or 72 million voting the other way. And so I'm not sure. I mean, I'm hoping that that's the case, right? That people begin to see these things more clearly. But I think if we, my worry is that with scarcity, which is gonna, I think, get even worse in the next 6 to 8 weeks, with people really worrying about being able to feed their kids and such, where we lay ourselves open to even becoming more fragmented.
Mm.
And so I personally think we're in a really dangerous moment between now and February, March
Yeah.
of 2021. And that the history, it'll be interesting to see what the history books make of this in 50 years when people look back and try to write out this particular story. I mean, I don't think people fully get it, that how bad off the country is economically, because many of us take our cue from the stock market. But if you look at, I was just watching the news and reading Texas newspapers, and I was looking at this miles long line of cars, you know, waiting to get food at a food bank. Just like, for as far as the eye could see, there are 4 lanes of cars. And that's being replayed all over the country. I just don't. I'm fearful that we don't really get how really bad it is, and we're being sidetracked in a way by everything happening with this election over or not, and any way to try to really use this particular time period to really plan for what's going to come next. We're losing the possibility, and that's really troubling. I mean, and the only thing close to it, and for me, and then really I'm going to stop talking until somebody unmutes themselves. The closest thing to this for me is sort of after the election in 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt gets elected, he defeats Herbert Hoover, and Roosevelt and Hoover go at each other pretty hard during the election cycle. And when the election is over, they don't want to talk to each other. And they really don't spend a lot of time. Roosevelt doesn't spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C., figuring out what's going on. But it's a little bit different than it is now. And so Franklin Roosevelt basically takes this whole collection of people that he is going to have in his administration, and they all go to Florida for almost 3 months, because back then you didn't take. So imagine if we were still in that setting back in the 1930s, you didn't take office until the middle of March. So you had a lame duck president from the first week in November until the middle of March. Took a constitutional amendment to change that, to have it be that you would assume the office on January 20th. People forget that because we're just so used to it being in January. But imagine if this was now, if in the acrimony we had now, it could stretch out potentially until early March. It might anyway in a different form, but and so Roosevelt goes away, and he's not privy to a lot of the government, what the government's doing, what's happening with the Depression, what's happening with bank failures, and all the rest of it. But he's able to come in fairly quickly, and in 100 days pass an incredible array of legislation. But the difference is that FDR has a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. It's a landslide election to get Republicans out of office because they're blamed for the Great Depression. And so he has a fairly malleable collection of people in the House and the Senate. And he can go forward. That's not going to happen this time. So we'll be fighting about who's going to be cabinet secretaries, and it's not going to be good. And all of this legacy of what we've just been talking about tonight is all going to get played out in there as well. So it's going to be, I mean, I'm teaching U.S. history in February, the U.S. history survey, and so it's going to be interesting to be talking about 1870 and 2020, 2021, all at the same time. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to balance it all, but anyway.
How relevant everything will still be, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Somebody else.
All right. We are at 8 o'clock. We have talked for an hour, so maybe that's give it 30 seconds of silence and then.
I have a question about the Freedom Riders, and I'm curious about the protests that were happening. Who was behind organizing this? I know that there were churches and there were students who were involved, but were there organizations who were making these things happen, and how did they do that?
Great question. So there were two organizations primarily leading the efforts: CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were the two that were the most sort of in the middle of organizing those things. And it's interesting that there was not, there's not unanimity within the broad, we sort of think of the civil rights movement in this very broad kind of a way, right? But there were disagreements within the movement about some of these things. And a lot of people were not so keen on the Freedom Rides. They thought they were too confrontational. And so this is when you begin to get an age split. And so the lunch counter sit-ins are SNCC and college students, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Freedom Rides as well. And so younger people are much more willing to be more confrontational, if you will, in terms of upping the ante. And in a way, like calling the question, like, what are we doing? Like, again, sort of King's, the Birmingham Jail thing, how long, too long? And so in marches and whatnot, during this particular period of time, that would always be a chant. People would sort of call and respond. Somebody would yell, how long? And everybody else would yell, too long. And that would be repeated over and over again, as if to say, look, like, it's been since 1619. What the hell are we doing? Like, how long, too long, right? And it would be, depending on the mood of the crowd, it could be really very plaintive, or it could be very angry and charged. And really, it's SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee moves in the direction by 68, particularly after King's assassination. The movement's splitting, but by 68, 69, 68, there are people, Stokely Carmichael and other people are now beginning to talk about Black Power. Stokely Carmichael writes a book called Black Power. Some people are actually talking about seizing territory in Mississippi and creating a Black state, kicking white people there out, just saying, like, this integration is not going to work. You get the rise of the Black Panther Party on the West Coast, and that sort of migrates east as well. New York City, you get an organization within the Dominican, Puerto Rican population called the Young Lords. You get similar organizations in LA with Mexican Americans and Mexican young people. And so the movement becomes much more confrontational. Because people have seen this decade and a half that I was talking about, and sort of the violent pushback against them, King being assassinated, all the other violence, Medgar Evers, other people, a host of things happening. And again, people are feeling like this is just going too slow. We're just going to be another 3 generations and we're still going to be arguing about the same things. I mean, in some ways, they're right, if you think about it. You think about what they're raising in 1965, and you think about what people are raising in 2020. If you've been in that movement for that amount of time, I mean, again, sort of like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Trayvon Martin, you know, any number. I mean, there's a whole list, right? It's sort of like, wow, it's the same thing. Justice denied, justice delayed. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult.
All of the books that were mentioned in your slideshow, we have in our consortium, if not in our library, and I sent a list with links to all the participants. So if you folks want to do further reading, that can be a jumping off point. You can certainly email me back if you have any follow-up questions, and I'll be happy to forward them on to Bob.
Yep, or email me directly.
Or email Bob directly.
Either way.
Donna, you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to say thank you.
Oh, great. All right.
Thanks for being here.
Happy Thanksgiving, folks. You know?
Stay safe.
Yeah.
Wear a mask.
Thank you, Bob.
It's crazy,
Thank
right?
you.
We're in crazy times, everybody. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Take care.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Donna.